1, whoop, 0. It's 11 o'clock. Good day, everyone. It's our starting time. I'm really excited. What I'd really appreciate, just as we get started and we're welcome everyone, is to type in type the words "hi" in the chat box if you can hear us, and we'll be on our way. As I say, welcome to today's webinar. Our focus is on the many myths of workplace bullying, and our presenters are Alan Sharland and Marlene Schwalje. I know you're all in for a treat, and we're really happy that so many people have chosen to participate. We intend to make it well worth your while. I'm John Ford, the founder of the HR Mediation Academy and the author of Peace at Work. This is the inaugural educational webinar of the Academy, a proud moment and a long time coming. Alan is a workplace mediator and coach from London, where he directs chaos conflict management. Alan was the director of a community mediation centre which developed the UK's first publicly available conflict coaching service in 2008. He's as passionate as you get about the subject and has given it a lot of thought. Welcome, Alan.
Hi, John. Thank you very much for the welcome. Hi to everybody. I hope you're going to enjoy what we talk about today and that you find it useful. And also, we'll be hoping to stay in touch with you afterwards to find out your thoughts about what we've said and whether there's any kind of follow-up support that you'd like from us.
Great. Thanks, Alan. Moving on to Marlene. Marlene's also a workplace mediator and coach. She's from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Marlene authored and advocated for the respectful workplace resolution passed unanimously by Santa Fe City Council and the Board of County Commissioners in 2010. The first time an initiative of its kind has been enacted in this country. She's an active and long-time board member of her local SHRM chapter. It's great to have you with us, Marlene.
Thank you, John. Hi, Alan. And hello, everyone. We're ready to get started.
Exactly. Let's get it on. I'm not sure which of the two of them is more passionate, but the great thing is their thinking is converged based on their direct experiences, their trials and errors, such that they're essentially on the same page. Alan's written a book and Marlene's writing one. The topic, of course, bullying. The webinar is going to be running for 90 minutes. I'll be moderating. Alan and Marlene will present. We'll be making use of the poll feature in the right-hand navigation bar. You may have to click on the tab next to the chat tab to open them. Please do engage. Right now, we'd like to know who's in the webinar with us. Please indicate your background in the poll on that right-hand side. And if for whatever reason it doesn't work, please don't worry. It's not vital. And as we get towards the end, depending on time, we may have opportunities for questions, and then we'll use the chat function again on the right-hand side. Bullying seems to be one of those topics that comes in and out of fashion, and yet the troubling behaviors that lead to the conclusion of bullying seem to have persisted despite fashion. It's just that increasingly the call is for legislation and a rights-based, legalistic solution to address the real problems that have drawn us all to the seminar. But is this the wise path forward? In the January-February 2015 issue of the HR magazine, a reader writes in to comment on a prior article on bullying and suggests that rather than waiting for legislation, HR professionals should actively address this issue in their workplace, and that expecting the government to address bullying diminishes our role and others' opinion of our profession. But what exactly is the issue? Is it a conflict? As a mediator, I was never encouraged to use the frame of bully, but I've often heard the label amongst others in conflict, especially when one or both doesn't feel confident of their ability to manage their relationship and set boundaries. I know that bullying includes behaviors that can lead to both physical and psychological harm, and I've often wondered how best to deal with it. That's what led me to Alan and Marlene in this webinar. So like the rest of you who chose to join us today, I'm eager to know about the myths. But one last thing, before we do, here's another poll to get you thinking. And now, Marlene and Alan, take it away and share with us what you have to share about the myths, and as I bring up that new poll.
Thank you. The first myth that we'd like to address today is that stronger legislation will solve the problem of workplace bullying. So let's first look at workplace bullying or workplace anti-bullying legislation just from the point of view of return on investment. Australia has probably the most comprehensive and really well-written legislation. It went into effect a year ago in January of 2014. Their legislation is overseen by the Fair Work Commission. The data is in for the first 9 months since implementation of that law, and it's really compelling. A total of 532 applications were made in 9 months to the Fair Work Commission alleging bullying. There was one finding of bullying, one finding that resulted in an order. So, an order to cease the behavior. So I've got to wonder, what if all the resources that are put into trying a case before the commission were instead spent on resources for early resolution and prevention within the workplace? It seems to me that the best part of Australia's law is that mediation is offered after a case is filed. And the fact that 111 of the 532 cases were resolved through the process, most of them through mediation, should perhaps be a hint to where the funds could do the most good. So here in the United States, as in other countries around the globe, anti-bullying legislation is making the rounds, and it's making some inroads. Last May, the New Hampshire Governor Maggie Hassan vetoed the law that her legislature had passed. She said that it was just too vague and would allow suits to be brought over issues like supervisory style. And she also disagreed because the law specifically excluded mediation from even being offered as an avenue for resolution. In Tennessee, the law was passed and signed, but no one's really happy because the language was vastly watered down. California's response would seem to be a more enlightened approach. They require training. It's supposed to be given as part of their biannual sexual harassment training regarding workplace abuse, certainly a much better term, but their definition, like in most legislation and organizational policies, by the way, still includes words like malicious, and trying to prove malice or intent is really a dead end. Anti-bullying laws are being considered by 5 states in the United States this year. So here's the point about legislation. Why wait until the pain is so bad? What if your organization focused instead on early resolution and prevention? Alan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Marlene. I think, because my main involvement in this is as a mediator, I think it's quite noticeable that where the attempt is made to use the legislation, so often, as you've identified, it doesn't actually go to the places that people want it to go to, and we'll be looking more in the webinar at why that is, both from our experience and because of the kind of the things that feed into the processes that are used. But I think for me, this is the thing. The myth is that stronger legislation will solve the problem. Well, the legislation at the moment is not working as effectively as people would want it to. And I think simply using something bigger or stronger or more powerful, but still trying to do the same job, is not the best way of trying to look at the problem. It's about looking at, are there other ways of dealing with such situations that could be more effective, or certainly as effective as the present situation. What we're not doing this evening or during this webinar is to try to suggest that legislation shouldn't be in place. What we're looking at is the fact that it's better to have options in how people deal with bullying allegations rather than simply think that the only option is to use legislation. And from my own experience of mediating situations, it's very commonly the case that people try to pursue what we're calling the proof and punish approach. and it doesn't lead anywhere, and it means everybody involved feels unhappy with the outcome. The person who alleges bullying doesn't feel supported. The person who's alleged to be the bully feels that there's a cloud over the head because they're not cleared of the allegation, because there's no conclusive outcome. The people who try to investigate it and find the evidence find it incredibly difficult, for reasons that we're going to be looking at in subsequent slides, to actually prove anything. And so in the end, it just ends up what I would call a circle of blame, and it doesn't really go anywhere. Whereas if people try things like mediation, it actually gives them an opportunity to step out of trying to prove things into a focus on trying to improve the situation, improve their relationship, to work on why isn't it working and what can we do to change that. And when that's possible, you know, I've got direct experience of, and Marlene as well, and John as well, I'm sure, of this actually meaning that people can retain their relationship instead of it break apart, and actually that they can improve their experience of going to work and working with the people that previously they found it very difficult to work with. And that's what we're trying to support the possibilities for in this webinar and beyond.
So shall we move on to myth number 2?
Yeah. So one of the things that I was alluding to in what I was just saying is this whole idea that bullying is clear and easy to define and identify. And one of the things that I focused on in the book is that if you actually try to explore what bullying actually is, if you do kind of searches online, if you look at various organizations' definitions of bullying, while their particular definition may seem clear and easy to define, actually putting it into practice proves incredibly difficult. I found a book during my research that listed at least 30 behaviors that were apparently characteristics of a bully, and I'll give you some examples. Examples included being suspicious, giving minimalistic responses when asked, "How are you?" Disagreeing with the person who feels bullied, being impatient, looking to blame, being critical of their organization. So that's six examples out of the 30 that I found that were meant to be characteristics of a bully. And I would think most of you will recognize that it's highly possible that any one of us in this webinar could probably be considered a bully if we explore whether we at some stage have carried out those behaviors. Now, you know, obviously bullying is often seen to be repeated actions, but the thing about it is often there can be a perception that someone's bullying us when that may not be the intention. That doesn't mean to say we can't object to the way that they're treating us, but it's whether we want to prove that they're bullying or whether we want to address how they're treating us, and whether we want to look to try to create a better way of relating with each other so that we can move on in our working relationship. Marlene, do you want to carry on anywhere with that?
You know, if we look at a typical situation that many folks encounter between a supervisor and employee, let's say that the employee is calling the supervisor a bully because the employee is held to heightened scrutiny. And maybe the supervisor believes that that heightened scrutiny is required because of performance issues with the employee. But maybe it's just not coming across to the employee in that way. And perhaps the manner that the supervisor is expressing that need is hurtful to the employee. So whether or not the label of bullying fits, the behavior might still hurt. The behavior is still hurtful, still problematic. Whether or not one person can be proven right and the other person can be proven wrong, the behavior can still damage the professional relationship. There's a quote from Dr. Doron Samuel, who is the CEO of Corporate Health Services in Australia, and he calls the word bullying a wastebasket term, the default label for preventable workplace conflict. It's really important for us to stress that some of the behaviors that are labeled as bullying can be serious and abusive, but the term is so overused as to be virtually meaningless. So how about myth number 3?
Okay.
Mediation is never an appropriate intervention. Well, as you've already heard, this myth is widely but not universally held. Australia, for example, has written mediation into their bullying legislation, but this myth is very widely held, primarily because, primarily by those who believe that bullying is a power issue and that it is never appropriate to bring people of disparate power into the same room, which really demonstrates a lack of understanding about mediation. Workplace mediators frequently, usually, have folks in the room that have disparate power, a supervisor and an employee, for example, and a workplace mediator is skilled at addressing these kinds of power disparities. It doesn't mean that, and we're not saying that mediation is always an appropriate intervention, but we certainly disagree that it is never an appropriate intervention. I'm very glad that I did not hear that I should not be mediating in bullying accusations for a long, long time. I just didn't know that I wasn't supposed to be doing that, so I did, and I do. And Alan, I know you do too.
Yeah, I would say that probably at least 3 out of every 4 workplace disputes that I'm mediating has an allegation of bullying within it, and I think one of the things that can often indicate how ambiguous it can be is that in many cases it can actually be whoever made the complaint first that is deemed to be the subject of bullying, the target of bullying, and the other person is the bully. Whereas if the other person had made the complaint first, it would have been the other way round. Because in many disputes in the workplace, people can feel bullied by each other. It can often be the case that, for example, a boss might be considered to be a bully, but as a result of that, that person is demonized, isolated, not kind of treated with a certain level of respect that might normally be expected. Or even if it's not someone who's a boss, it may be someone in a team who's considered to be a bully, and what can then happen is that person then gets isolated and stigmatized. And some people may say, well, that's because of the way they behave, but the point is that it's them becoming bullying in return towards that person. So this is why it becomes very ambiguous and almost hypocritical in the way that things are dealt with. But the point really is that it's whether it is bullying or isn't bullying that becomes the sticking point. And what mediation can offer is an opportunity to let go of the label of bullying and just look at what has actually happened between people. You know, what is it that this person has done that you found uncomfortable? Well, they shouted at me, or they swear when I get things wrong. Okay, so what would be a way that you would want them to communicate with you about the mistakes that you've made? When people say that someone's micromanaging them, how do they want to be managed differently? What would work for them? So mediation provides an opportunity to actually talk through the experiences that people are having and to identify what they're not comfortable with. Rather than simply accuse someone of being a bully, it's about looking at what can be learned from the situation and what can change as a consequence. And what that does is it supports the reparation of a relationship rather than a bullying investigation or an adversarial process, which is almost always going to cause the relationship to break apart and cause discomfort, not only for the people involved, but the people who are around them as well. But I think the point about the myth is mediation is never an appropriate intervention. I mean, as Marlene said, it's a good job I hadn't heard that, because, I mean, probably 3 out of 4 of the cases that I'm involved in include the allegation of bullying. And yet, the same proportion, I would say, at least, create a resolution in their situation and are able to move forward. So, yeah, we definitely would say that that's a myth, because it just doesn't match our experience.
So while in our experience, the vast majority can achieve resolution through mediation. Every mediator has different different skills and a different perspective. And Alan, you and I have discussed an example that I recently experienced where there was a relationship issue between one teacher and two of her colleagues. And in this situation, I had extensive conflict coaching with each of the participants before we decided to bring them in and to meet in dyads, to meet one-on-one. But with each of those interactions, with the one-on-one meetings, one of the individuals demonstrated some behaviors at the very, very end of the session that really would have taken a great deal of additional time and effort to sort through with the other party. And I just didn't make a recommendation to the administrator in that situation that would be an investment that could be worthwhile for her. I felt that there were some issues that were demonstrated that were beyond my ability as a mediator, and probably beyond my scope as a mediator. And Alan, you may have handled that situation a little bit differently.
Yeah, I mean, my approach is really, if there is a request by people that they want to try to meet together to resolve their difficulty, then I go along with them and try to support them in doing so. You know, I trust for me, it's about people taking responsibility for where they want to go with their situation. And once that responsibility is placed upon them, you know, normally it's going to be the case that they do come through and create something that works for them. I mean, we've both got kind of various different anecdotes, haven't we? We've talked about other ones. I mentioned a couple of senior academics who both had grievance procedures out against each other, but having started the procedures, they started to realize how much of a damaging impact it was having on their own experience of going to work, let alone the relationship between them. They weren't wanting to come into work so much. They were trying to avoid going to meetings where the other person would be. It was having a very damaging effect on their working relationship and their work experience. But they chose to try mediation because they were recognizing how difficult it was to take the grievance procedures out against each other. And they sat through 2 long meetings, and it was only at the very end of the second meeting that they actually finally came to the kind of the keystone of what it was that they wanted to decide and move forward from. But it meant that they were able to set their grievance procedures aside. They were able to continue working alongside each other. They clarified how they wanted to do that, and they were able to repair their relationship. Basically, they weren't going to be friends, but they were going to be able to be professional senior academics working alongside each other. And within their grievance procedures were mutual allegations of bullying behaviour within meetings, directly with each other. But, you know, that wasn't what we were focusing on. Are you a bully or aren't you a bully? It's what do they want that will improve their relationship and help them to carry forward that working relationship and stay in their jobs. Because, as we know, many bullying allegations will lead to someone at some stage leaving their work environment as a consequence, or taking a lot of time off sick. On to the next one.
Yes, I think that's actually the subject of our next poll, but Alan, we had the poll results from number 2.
Okay.
How damaging was the relationship? Do you want to comment on the results?
I can't see the results, Marlene. Can you read them out for me?
I don't have them in front of me, but and I don't know if John, we can go back to the previous.
I have what I had was 6% said very successful, 22% said fairly successful, 61% said unsuccessful, and 11% said damaging.
Gosh. Yeah. So we're
Yeah, so 72% of participants in this webinar feel that something is to be desired. And I would also certainly love to hear at some point more about those who believe that their approach, their policy and procedure is very or somewhat successful. That would be excellent feedback as well.
Move on to the next one. You okay with this one?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. So one of the things we wanted to identify, problems cannot be solved at the same level of consciousness that created them. And this is quite an issue for me, that one of the features for me of many approaches to bullying allegations seems to be to try to find a bully or create a bully that can bully the bully. It seems to go around in circles, and the reason that photograph is there is that that's an example of a punishment for a boy of probably 10 to 12 years old who was deemed to be a bully by someone, and he was made to stand by a roadside, and people who drove past were meant to honk if they hated bullies. So I'll take one definition of bullying that I've got, but there are many that would fit this. This one is the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service in the UK, ACAS, and one of their the phrases from one of their definition of bullying is offensive, intimidating, malicious or insulting behaviour, and abuse or misuse of power through means that undermine, humiliate, denigrate or injure the recipient. And I think for me it could be quite easy to see that there's an abuse of power here with the intention of trying to humiliate or denigrate that child for acting in a way which was deemed to be a bully. So this isn't to condone any actions that he carried out, but to bully him in return would seem to be a fairly hypocritical and ineffective way of responding. And this is why we've used that quote from Einstein. I hope it's from Einstein. Lots of quotes are attributed to him, but I'm pretty sure this one is correctly attributed. Problems cannot be solved at the same level of consciousness that created them. So bullying to eliminate bullying is not an effective response. And for me, a feature of many proof or punish investigative responses to bullying in many organisations is very much in that kind of circle of bullying. It's always about finding a bigger bully to bully the bully. And for me, that's one of the many reasons why such approaches are ineffective.
Yeah, humiliation is never okay. And what we're about today is achieving a different level of consciousness, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Trying to move things forward in a more constructive manner.
Okay.
Well, great, guys. That was most helpful. My sense is we're ready to move on to look at the two huge mistakes. Certainly, everything that you made sense, or everything that you said made sense. And of course, as a mediator, I was really relieved to know and to have my own experiences confirmed, because I also have often mediated successfully where there were allegations of bullying. And while I don't begrudge the need for some legislation, I'm not sure that bullying is the only or indeed the correct frame for that challenge. But be that as it may, what about the mistakes? If those were the myths, what are the mistakes our organizations are making as a result? And you'll see as we shift into this this next section on the two mistakes, we still have there's another poll that I've already put up, so it's waiting for you. But once we're done, Marlene and Alan, you can take it away and share a little bit more about the mistakes.
Okay. Folks are considering the next poll. Let's talk about mistake number one, the labels and the language that vilify and victimize. I've never been much of a fan of labels of any kind, because labels put human beings in boxes and they tend to stick. Once they're applied, a label is going to constrict the ability to even look at a person or a situation from different perspectives. And certainly there's no inclination to dialogue or to brainstorm out-of-the-box options to resolve an issue or to address a behavior problem. So imagine this conversation. Some of you have certainly experienced something like this. Joe, step into my office. Your direct reports say that you're a bully. That's a pretty short conversation. In calling someone bully, the alleged perpetrator is vilified and demonized and shuts down to the possibility of insight or intervention. And what happens when you call someone a victim? You're really disempowering that person from making any changes that might impact the dynamic. And the labels themselves already predetermine, prejudge that one person is right and the other is wrong. Alan, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we'll be looking at other ways of wanting to give a name to the people involved in such situations, which doesn't cause that polarity within the situation, which recognizes that it's a relationship rather than simply someone who's passive and someone who's very active. And as Marlene's been saying, one of the things about people being called a victim is they're seen as they're disempowered, that they're unable to influence the dynamics of the relationship, that the bully is the protagonist, purely the protagonist, and the other person passively experiences their behaviors. But as Marlene was also pointing out, the very label of bully means that the person who's given that label is very unlikely to want to be self-reflective, because to start to be self-reflective when you're accused of being something negative means you may be open to accepting that negative label. So they're far less likely to remain open to that self-reflection while that label appears above them. And this is why, again, what we're saying is it's not useful to simply say you've been accused of being a bully. It's much better to say someone is finding some of your behavior difficult. What we'd like to look at is how that can change so that your working relationship can be improved and that you can get on together. Within none of that is there a label of the person. It's about talking about the behavior that the person is in the experience of the other person exhibiting, and then there can be a discussion about how that behavior is interpreted. But when it's a personal label that's been allocated, it's extremely normal for someone to defend against it rather than be open to reflecting on whether there's anything that they could be doing differently. And similarly for the victim, very often to suggest that the person who's considered to be the victim is able to influence the situation can often be called victim blaming. It's a phrase that I've heard suggested about what I've discussed before. But the point is, we're looking at the fact that it's a relationship, and even if someone does find it very difficult to experience the behavior of the other person, it doesn't mean to say that there can't be things done to support them in finding a better way of responding for themselves that are more self-supporting. You know, it's very rarely the case that in a team where one person is considered to be a bully, that everybody in that team sees them as a bully. There will be some people who will feel that more strongly than others, and some won't be as affected. So there must be ways that they've learned to behave to respond to the person's behavior that means they don't feel bullied by them. So a lot can be learned from those people about how they're dealing with it. It doesn't mean to say the other people can just copy that, because it may not be right for them, but it does acknowledge that it's possible to be in the person's presence without feeling that they're always bullying someone. So what we're about is trying to support both people in improving their relationship and moving forward from that rather than becoming entrenched in those labels.
Exactly. So moving on to mistake number 2, think about the time that you spend in your organization in whatever role. We have lots of HR people, we have ADR professionals, managers, employees, all kinds of people in this webinar. And think about the amount of time, once there's an allegation of bullying, that is devoted to proving that allegation, or even proving that there was malicious intent behind that allegation, depending on what your policy or legislation may call for. Let's remind ourselves, what's the imperative here? When interpersonal or interactional behaviors get in the way of productivity or the organizational mission, the organization needs to take prompt and effective action so that professional relationships are sufficiently restored so that folks can get back to work. But fitting problem workplace behaviors into the bullying box, into that language that you need to prove, can either distract or delay or distort the action, or even become more disruptive to the workplace if a person who is committing some behaviors that are problematic is not rising to the level of bullying, so that person is exonerated. So we have a scenario that is ripe for either under or overreaction. And meantime, what happens to the people who are impacted by all of those unresolved and painful problem behaviors that just might not fit into the proof, that just might not fit into the policy definition of bullying? Alan, what's your experience been?
Yeah, you know, looking through the list that we've got there, it is the point we were wanting to make is that it's not simply a two-person situation. A whole range of other side effects arise from an allegation of bullying. Those within any particular team might feel they've got to side with someone or against someone, or they may feel they can't engage in conversations because they'll get drawn into the debate about whether someone is a bully or they're not a bully. There are a wide range of impacts that perhaps don't get recognised as a consequence of a bullying allegation. And again, what we're looking at is an approach that supports all of that being restored and improved, so that there isn't a discomfort talking about difficulties in relationships. It actually becomes something that can be learned from and improved upon. And I think the outcome, as Marlene was referring to, the outcome of any such situation, even if there is someone who's deemed to be you know, vindicated and the other person is proven to be the bully, or the other person is proven to be, someone is proven not to be a bully, and so the person who felt bullied is perhaps considered to have made an unreasonable accusation. The consequences afterwards of that kind of experience are incredibly damaging to a team's morale, their willingness to communicate with each other, etc. So it's not the end of it. It's not the end of it to come to some kind of conclusion. And as we've said, in many cases, there is no end to the conclusion. So that kind of background festering of difficulty within the team continues. And the process involved does not support that being restored. You know, as I say, we're not saying there should not be such processes, but it's about looking at whether it should be the only option available to people in such situations, or whether it should always default to that as the only possibility. We're talking about there being an alternative which can be extremely effective in supporting those situations in being improved. And I'll go on to the next slide.
Yes, I think it's important to underscore what you just said, Alan, that many organizational processes do require an investigation, and we're not suggesting that that process be supplanted, but we are suggesting choices, and we are suggesting approaches that will supplement an investigative procedure.
Yeah, exactly. Choices. That's the thing. I mean, when we talk about empowerment, choices are a feature of empowerment. People can choose to take the investigative approach if they feel very strongly that they have a right and a good case to do so. And we're certainly not suggesting that people shouldn't have that opportunity. Absolutely not. You know, it's very much right and appropriate that if people feel strongly enough about this situation that they that they wish for that to be the way they go forward, then they should be able to do that. But as we've said here, or as is alluded to in this phrase, to the man or person, whoever, that has only a hammer in their toolkit, every problem looks like a nail. And what we're suggesting is that actually it shouldn't have to be that way. There should be other tools and other kind of activities that they're engaged in that can help move the situation forward. If investigation or proof and punish is the only option available, it very often may not be the most effective option that could be available. And where it is the only option available, predominantly it seems to be that it doesn't lead to a useful or effective outcome.
And Alan, you previously alluded to one of the outcomes frequently being that folks who are involved leave an organization. And we have the results of our next poll that demonstrates that that's very much the experience of our listeners today.
Okay. What are those results, Marlene?
That is, in any bullying allegation you are aware of at your organization, what proportion would you estimate led to at least one person involved, either leaving within 1 year or taking long-term sickness leave? And 17% of our respondents experienced that in up to a quarter of bullying allegations. 24%, about a quarter of our respondents, experienced that at least one person left in from a quarter to a half of bullying allegations. 46% experienced a person leaving in half to 3/4 of bullying allegations, and 13% experienced a person leaving in 3/4 to 100% to all of the bullying allegations within their organization. And that's a very serious outcome indeed, whoever that individual may be.
Yeah.
Very costly to an organization.
Absolutely. I mean, that's very much, in a sense, I guess in a way it's almost become so commonly expected that that's the consequence that it almost isn't shocking. But actually, when you consider that it is entirely possible for that not to be the consequence, then it kind of sets it in contrast that actually it doesn't have to be that way. And you know, we've talked about mediation. We're not necessarily saying that it always has to be something like mediation. It could be simply a differently facilitated conversation to an investigative conversation that an HR officer or manager or a team manager might have with people, that isn't about investigating, but it is about supporting a repaired relationship, an improved relationship. So we're not saying it's always got to be mediation or conflict coaching that supports such situations. It's entirely possible for people within an organization to use the skills that we're going to be talking about in a little bit to do that, but that it's not always necessary that people should leave following such situations.
Great. Thanks, guys. It continues to fascinate me. Your comments about labeling and the overuse of the investigation ring true for me. Labeling is not far off name calling, and that's the kind of verbal behaviors that mediators typically discourage. And if any of you have read my book, Peace at Work, you'll know that I'm also of the view that the investigation is necessary, but an overused tool. Other tools are needed that are more relationship friendly. To me, they are the way forward for HR professionals who want to step up to this challenge. But now, I think everyone wants to know, Alan and Marlene, what is that big secret? And I just put up another poll. I know that there's another poll you want the participants to attend to before you reveal all. So let's see what it is. Oh, time for your input. That's the poll that's up right now, poll number 4. Please participate in that. And here we go.
Ready for the secret?
Ready for the secret.
Okay. So it's very simple. Don't try to prove it.
Help them
improve it. That's all we're saying. That as an alternative, that you support people in trying to improve their relationship, and so often it's assumed that that's simply not going to be possible. And what we're saying is it is possible. We recognize that quite often there hasn't been perhaps a history of seeing it as possible, and so practices haven't occurred which have then made it possible. But what we're trying to say is that while we fully acknowledge that the prove it approach may be necessary in some situations, to simply provide that alternative to help people improve their relationship, their working relationship, is something that can help in a large number of situations where bullying is alleged. And so that's it, really. Don't try to prove it, help them improve it.
Yes.
Well, there we go. I know sometimes it's like that we're all waiting for the big secret and we expect it to be something none of us had ever thought of before, but I think it really, really does make sense. I think now at a practical level, folks in HR and other dispute resolution professionals are wondering, what can they do? What are the skills that they need to handle these tricky challenges, like when an allegation of bullying is made?
Okay.
So the solution is simple, isn't it? But that doesn't mean that it's easy. So we've spent the first half of our webinar today sharing why. And now it's time to discuss how. What are the supports? What are the skills that can help you in your organizations? So let's launch into some suggestions and solutions in our remaining time. And we want you to know as well that we're going to introduce the solutions today, and we'll be advancing and developing them more deeply in upcoming webinars. So the first solution Alan has alluded to, and that's a conversation, isn't it, Alan?
Yeah, exactly. So you might notice we've created a couple of new words which we think you won't find in the Oxford English Dictionary or Merriam-Webster or any other online or other reference points, but we're calling the person who alleges bullying the allegor, and you'll see in the next slide we call the person who is accused of bullying or difficult behaviour of some kind the allegee. So this is what we'll be discussing from now on. So what we're saying is that the approach that enables there to be an improved relationship is a discussion that focuses on behaviours, not labels. So we've mentioned that already. Instead of, you know, what is it that this person does, or why is it you think they're a bully, what's your proof, what's your evidence, we're saying, so what is it they do that you find uncomfortable, and what would you like that would be different so that you don't have to feel uncomfortable in their presence, and you know, what would help you to feel more kind of supported, more able to get on with what you need to do. What are the circumstances? So looking at the context in which things happen, what are the circumstances in which this happens? Is it a time when you're under a lot of stress? You know, what is it? Are they accusing you of making lots of mistakes but not helping you? So we're trying to support people but without taking sides. So we're not investigating on behalf of the alleged kind of victim. We're supporting that individual in trying to create a better relationship. We're looking at the reasons why people might be behaving the way that they do. You know, what are the causes for someone, I don't know, swearing or feeling intimidated? You know, what are the reasons why those things are happening? What kind of insights are people getting through the discussion about other ways that might go forward, and what support can be provided for them in taking those new ideas forward in how they're going to deal with a different working relationship with the other person. Explore the role that they have and their responses within the dynamics of their relationship, and also assess their willingness to have a direct and respectful conversation with the other person, with the allegee. Now, that may be within a mediation. it may be within a facilitated conversation by a manager or a colleague or an HR manager, but it may even be just between themselves. You know, what are the possibilities of them actually having a direct and respectful conversation between each other? What would support them with that? And that's where we're exploring openness to interventions as well. But the whole point about all of this is, and it's something that I always say when I'm providing mediation, is there's nothing, when I'm mediating, I always make it very clear to people, there's nothing I can do to try to help people to prove someone is wrong and that they're right. That's not the purpose of my role as mediator. The only thing I can provide for them is support in creating a better way forward from their situation. And that's what underpins all of these interventions that we're talking about today, whether it's within a mediation or whether it's a facilitated conversation by somebody else, or even their own one-to-one conversation with each other, should they feel able to do that. And we're also about supporting what they need in order to have that conversation, again, whether with somebody else present or whether just directly with each other, between each other. Because people do have one-to-one conversations with each other in the workplace, but we recognise about difficulties they have with each other, obviously, because it happens frequently. But we're also acknowledging that sometimes people can find that very difficult. So what might help them to do that? And if at the time they don't feel comfortable doing it, perhaps they want support with that. And again, that could be formally through mediation, or it could be by a colleague. I'll pass you over to Marlene. Do you want to say anything on this one, or should you want to move straight on to the allegee?
Well, you know, when we're talking about addressing possible motivations and supporting insights, we're talking about developing some understanding for the other individual as well as themselves. So we ask not just in this initial conversation, not just what are your motivations in bringing this allegation forward. That might be a bit abrasive as a question, although that might be something, an area to explore. It certainly is an area to explore. Perhaps the alleger received a performance evaluation that is causing concern. Perhaps something happened within the relationship that's causing concern. Knowing that will help the manager, the HR manager, to to grab onto something and look at how an improved relationship might be achieved. But we're also going to ask the alleger, what do you think might be the other guy's motivation in calling you out, in raising her voice, in doing whatever the problematic behavior was? And that can be a really startling question for a person to be asked. I often see a double take when I ask that question, and sometimes asking that question can be the beginning of compassion. We might find that the person making the allegation might say, well, you know, maybe they were having a rough time, or, you know, I just saw their boss in their office for a long time. Maybe something happened in that conversation. And again, these are the kinds of clues that are going to allow us to work with each individual and work with both to develop their relationship. Mm-hmm. So let's move on to the conversation with the allegee. And the first thing that you might notice is that it really is the same as the conversation we're going to have with the person making the allegation, and that is a radical and controversial notion that we would actually treat the allegee with the same respect, with the same support, that the first conversation with somebody who's been called a bully might be a supportive conversation. So again, here we're going to focus on the behaviors. We're going to move away from that first conversation. Step into my office, your direct reports say that you've been bullying them, and instead we're going to share that one of these direct reports was concerned because in a staff meeting they felt called out about typos that were on something that they had produced, and they were quite embarrassed in front of their peers. We're going to focus on the specific behaviors. We're not going to focus on the labels. We will look at the context. At this point, we're going to have some understanding from the person making the allegation of their perception of the context. Might be a completely different conversation if the supervisor had called the employee out in a respectful way, privately in their office rather than in front of other staff people. We will support that individual. We might explore with them what's going on for you. Are you feeling under a great deal of pressure? Are there performance requirements that you're concerned that your staff may not be meeting? Are there other skills that might help you develop other ways of helping your staff people perform? We'll be talking a little bit more about this in a couple of slides. We're going to ask that the allegee, just as we did the allegor, not only about what's up for them, but also what do you think is happening for that individual? What do you think is going on for the person who brought the complaint? Again, a beginning of developing humanity, compassion between the participants in the dynamic. We will explore that role in the dynamic. We're not going to ignore it. We will certainly explore it. And again, just as Alan shared with the allegor, we'll look at, are you willing to have a direct and respectful conversation with that person? Maybe we can work some things out together if we have a conversation where you can share with the person bringing the complaint what was happening for you, or why you felt that that was the time to make that particular comment. Or maybe you can hear from them. Are you open to hearing from them how it affected them, and that the words that you used or the setting was inappropriate or hurtful? And we'll also start to have a conversation about other supports and interventions that might support that person individually in their role in the organization, as well as support the potential of rectifying the relationship with the allegor bringing the complaint.
I was just going to refer to the last poll. I was just going to go to what the most significant negative impact of a bullying allegation was at the place of work. So we've got 23% of people said damage to staff morale, 20% said damage to productivity, 30% high amount of staff time spent dealing with it, 14% damage to effective team communication, 12% never resolved, causing frustration for all involved, but only 1% determination of winners and losers was the most significant negative impact. But the two kind of, or the three main kind of highest ones are damage to staff morale, productivity, and the amount of time spent dealing with it. And you know, again, what we're saying is it's not going to eliminate all of that, but we think this approach significantly reduces those negative impacts, because they're all about, the approach is about seeing it as an opportunity for what I would call creative change. And that's not necessarily how people would normally see a difficult situation, but it's about, certainly from a mediation point of view, it's about trying to see what the opportunity is within any difficult situation like this. Because if someone can learn to manage their staff more effectively as a result of something like this, they're going to be a better manager. If someone can learn to be more assertive towards behaviours they find difficult as a consequence of this, they're going to be a more confident, more content employee and individual. Whereas if it's only about trying to prove that someone is or is not a bully, or that being the main focus of the processes that they go through, those outcomes are far less likely to come about as a result. Again, so this is what we're saying we believe is possible, and I would say is definitely possible, because it's what I see happen as a consequence of mediations and conflict coaching.
So, Alan, before we move on to conflict coaching, I think we have another request for input.
And I think it's me doing this one. Is that right?
I believe so.
I think I am. So I better get my capabilities in gear and post this. Bear with me. I think the poll is out. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Good. Thank you. I came through that with flying colours, fortunately. Trust me for one, and I can manage it. But if you'd have put me through all of them, I wouldn't have coped. So, moving on.
So please share with us in the next poll whether you've ever tried mediation or conflict coaching.
Mm-hmm. And we'll look at the outcome of that in a little while, as we have done with the other ones. But we're going to move on to talk a little bit about coaching as one of the options that can provide support in these situations. But as we've said, there's coaching, there's mediation, but there's also the possibility of people within the organization, not necessarily an external coach or mediator, but also the possibility of people developing these skills and practices within the organization to be able to support this approach to situations where bullying has been alleged. So with coaching, for the allegor, the person who feels that they've been bullied, is if that's how they've started the process by saying that someone has been bullying them, if they choose to try this kind of alternative option, then we can support them with developing strengths in response to those situations, supporting their empowerment, helping them to reconsider how they're responding in the situation, and if they find that things are kind of getting out of hand, how they may be able to kind of de-escalate those situations for their own self-support, so that it kind of works for them, so that they're able to feel more competent and confident within those situations arising. To help them consider what resources are available to them, what options they have in those situations, all of which are geared towards supporting them in supporting themselves, but not supporting them against the other person. So it's an important point to register. We're not giving them kind of armories to then use to kind of fire at the other person. We're enabling them to support themselves in response to how the other person is behaving, if they're finding that difficult. And it's a conversation which is purely around helping them to be creative and reflective, or reflective and then creative in response to what they're finding difficult, and to say, okay, what is going to be a way that's going to work for you? What do you need in order to be able to do that? What will you do if the same thing happens again that you've been unhappy with in the past? What resources are available to you to support you if that happens? You know, and that can be about looking at how they're conversing with the person in response to their behaviors. It can be looking at you know, how they're feeling in the situation and what they might be able to do to support themselves with how they're feeling. You know, if they're feeling frightened, what are they frightened about, and what might help them if they're feeling frightened? You know, anything that comes up for them. We can't be specific about these things because every situation is going to be individual and unique. But it's whatever their challenge is in that situation, we're supporting them in finding a way of being more competent and confident and self-assertive within that context. With the allegee, we can look at what support they need, but not in a judgmental way, not saying, you know, you're a bully, so you need to go on a better manager's course or something, and just kind of prescribe something for them on the basis that
management is popular, isn't it, Alan?
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing. When there's been a prescription from outside about what's wrong with the individuals, it's very often rejected and resented anyway. So what we're about is supporting people to make their own decisions about what they think is going to help them to be more effective in their context. So if they've been judged as being a bully by someone, what will help them to be able to respond and relate to that person in a way that isn't felt to be to be bullying. You know, they may feel very strongly they haven't been a bully, but nevertheless the allegation has come up. So what will help them to still be assertive in the way they manage, but at the same time not in a way that's perceived as difficult by others. You know, to help them clarify what's going on in the situation, their perceptions, to support them with any insights they get in the situation, skill building, to look at how they respond to people that perhaps they're working alongside or that they're managing, whatever their role is. You know, do they tend to use labels themselves? You know, can they express themselves in a different way that isn't felt to be threatening or intimidating? So all of this is always about helping them to reflect and then create a better way forward. It's not about finding out, are you a bully or are you not a bully? You know, prove it, give us the evidence, this is what someone else says, prove that they're wrong. You know, it's all very kind of painting people into a corner, whereas what we're trying to do is support people in opening up and being more creative and respectful towards each other in the relationship that they're presently experiencing. And in a sense, as a summary for all of that, is to help people to develop the skills to have a clear, compassionate, direct conversation. Yeah, as a summary. Anything from you, Marlene? Do you want to say on that, or move on?
Sure. Frequently, this is what folks want to do. They want the support to move on so that they can have a respectful relationship with the other person. So in coaching, to have these skills, we can do a lot of role playing. We will help sort through some possible scenarios, perhaps, that might come up. What happens if your supervisor says that that there's a deficiency in your performance? Is there a way that you need your supervisor to say that? How can you respond if your supervisor is, or if the other individual involved in this dynamic is more abrasive than you think is appropriate? So I think that we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide. So mediation, which certainly we've been discussing a lot, and we both want to underline what Alan has already said, and that is that we're not anticipating or advocating by any means that an external individual needs to be engaged in this process. We are all devoted to teaching these skills so that people within the workplace have mediation skills, conflict coaching skills, and the other skills that we're talking about. And we will provide greater development, greater skill development in future webinars. But mediation might feel rather formal and legalistic to some individuals. You know, just the word might put some people off. In New Mexico, for example, where I have the fortune of living and working, we have a Mediation Procedures Act. In the Mediation Procedures Act, if there is an agreement, if there is a settlement, the individuals are required to put that settlement in writing, and that becomes a formal contract. Well, that might be absolutely fine and appropriate for many kinds of mediations. What I find is that very frequently the agreement in an employee to employee mediation or in a workplace mediation, that agreement might be in the form of a sticky note that's attached to somebody's computer as a reminder, and that's okay. So we might want to use a different term. We might want to call this a facilitated conversation. And what you're seeing are some variations on the theme of mediation. Certainly, whether we call it a facilitated conversation or mediation, the process itself is going to model for folks, how do you have a dialogue? How do you have a respectful dialogue? How can you disagree? Because there is no expectation that you're always going to agree. So when you don't, what's that going to look like for each of you? Let's do some planning. Let's have some creativity around what that might look like. Particularly when there is an employee-supervisor situation, we can model in the process, how do you express expectations in a way that will not be hurtful to the employee? Sometimes people need to hear things that they might not want to hear. That doesn't mean that it has to be done in a harsh manner. The same with feedback. Ongoing feedback is so often at the heart of a problematic relationship between employee and supervisor. So we can create some expectations around that feedback. Do you want to sit down every week, every month, and have a conversation about projects that you've been working on? Do you need to have some supports put in place so that you have the skills to do that project? Would you rather that your supervisor just pop into your office every day, a couple times a day, and see how you're doing? And that might be an opportunity to ask for the kind of support that you need. Behavioral contracting is another variation on the theme of mediation that I found extremely, extremely useful, particularly if employees or if any of the individuals involved just feel that mediation is going to dig too deeply into their psyche and they just don't want to do that. Behavioral contracting can be a step toward a mediation or a process that might look a little bit more deeply into the interactions or into the relationships. It's often a really good beginning step. And what that looks like might be, if Joe does this, then Jane will do that. It could be as simple as, if Jane stands up, then that's a signal to Joe that she's feeling uncomfortable. If Joe feels that Jane isn't listening, isn't hearing the organization's expectations, then he will use these words to frame the expectation. So we can really get to some of the creative resolutions that Alan has been leading up to. And to share just one, a situation where employees were disagreeing with each other, were having considerable interaction issues in a very open setting, in a setting with cubby holes, and each accused the other of bullying her. These employees came up with a code word, and their code word was pelican. And you can imagine that there aren't too many pelicans in New Mexico, so it's kind of an odd word. They figured that anybody around them who heard what they were saying, which was everybody, wouldn't get it, wouldn't understand the word. What it meant to them was quite specific. It meant to them, I need some space, let's take an hour, and then let's get back together. Or let's meet tomorrow morning and talk about this interaction and talk about what each of us might have been able to do differently. So the goal really of the mediation process, as Alan has shared, quite clearly is to achieve mutual understanding, not agreement, but to understand, to humanize each other, and to understand each other.
Yeah, and it's interesting that that's kind of, in a sense, what mutual understanding led you to refer to, Marlene, because for me it then takes us back to what you were saying at the very start about this idea that sometimes people see mediation as almost as formal and threatening as the idea of taking an adversarial route. But and it surprised me to hear that you said about the need to commit things to paper and sign it as a contract in New Mexico, because I can imagine that could be quite a difficult kind of consideration for people wanting to look at mediation. I mean, in my own experience of workplace mediation, where I work in the kind of London area, I would say at least 2 out of 3 to 3 out of 4 cases that where people meet together and come to some form of resolution, they don't want anything written down. They want to just move on and forget about it. They don't want anything on their records. They don't want to kind of have it recorded and sent to anyone. They just want to be able to sit down, work it out with each other, and move on. And you know, the organisations that I work with are open to that possibility. They're not wanting some kind of checklist to kind of hold people to as if it's a contract. They acknowledge that maybe the agreement in itself is not necessarily the most effective outcome to a mediation. It's mutual understanding, and that may not mean agreement. It may not be something you can write down on a piece of paper and say, we decided this, we agreed to that, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. It may just be, actually understand now why they get angry in that situation, and in future I can kind of do something differently, but I don't need to put it down on a piece of paper. And the point is, you know, referring to the humanize each other idea, we're now not talking about bully victim, we're talking about Fred and Joe, who have fallen out and now they're talking to each other, and they've found a way of doing so. They've learned how to dialogue, they've learned how to disagree without criticizing each other, they've learned how to express their expectations or to see that it's possible, because they've sat in a room for maybe 2 to 3 hours doing that without it ending up in a kind of a verbal fight or even a concern about something physical happening. And these all become possible when a process and approach like this is used, whereas it's incredibly unlikely to be happening if it became a formal investigation, proof and punish kind of approach. So this is why we're saying that it is a parallel, not a replacement, but a parallel process that can be available to people to support them in improving their working relationship. So instead of proving, we're supporting them in improving their working relationship. And just to refer to the outcome of the last poll, it's interesting actually. That's a fairly high number. 56% of people said that they have tried mediation or conflict coaching as a support or intervention in a bullying allegation at their organisation. So 56%, which is actually quite a good sign. And it will be interesting for us to hear to what extent they considered that to be effective. If they did, why? If they didn't, why? You know, it would be interesting to us to hear beyond this webinar, you know, your kind of thoughts and your feedback on that, because we'd be very interested in hearing what your experiences are and any questions that you have following this. Move on to the next one. So,
let's.
Yeah.
So we can hear you out there. We really can. We can hear that some of you are thinking, are saying to yourselves, this is all well and good, but my organizational leadership just doesn't set the right tone. The issue is really the tone from the top. And, you know, we are very alert to the fact that we're probably not all living in ideal organizations. We understand that. And what we want to suggest is that by empowering yourself, you're going to create change. It might be subtle at first, but by empowering yourself with these skills, with these tools, you are going to create change within your sphere of influence. And your sphere of influence gets wider and wider and wider, just like a couple of emails through LinkedIn have led to scores of folks signing up for this webinar. It really is the same idea. Even your individual and subtle changes, even if you just decide to refrain from the use of words like bully and victim, can lead to organizational changes that are seismic. Alan?
Yeah, I think that is the point we want to make. In a sense, it's in keeping with the ethos of what we're saying. You know, the whole thing about the approach that we're talking about is one which says it's supporting the individual in creating change in their relationship with others. So it's never about saying you've got to rely on somebody else to change before anything can change for you. And that applies to the person who's alleged to be a bully or the person who feels that they're being bullied. We're supporting those individuals, and then if they wish to, we're supporting them together in creating a change themselves. So as Marlene said, we fully acknowledge that many environments may not feel like they're conducive to this kind of approach, but it's, in a way, it's not about what your environment is that's the main factor. It's how you feel and whether there might be things that you can do that support you in carrying through this kind of approach. And our interest certainly is in supporting you in doing so if you want that support. But we're wanting to try to identify it, in a sense, it can't rely on what else goes on around, because in a sense that's what takes us back to the victim role. It's about saying what can be done, to what extent can you empower yourself within your sphere of influence in whatever context it is or whatever role it is that you're carrying out. Shall I move on to the next one, Marlene?
Yes, let's.
Yeah. And so in terms of things like organisational culture, you know, this approach is able to support the idea of group alignment, group shared vision, whatever kind of phrase is kind of your preference, to be able to create and then sustain a respectful workplace. Because taking this approach is just simply not the other approach. So therefore it's about trying to see things as a cooperative process. And again, we may feel other people are not being cooperative. So then it's a question of, so what would help you if they're not being cooperative? What support do you need to be able to create and sustain a respectful workplace so that there's group alignment or organisational alignment about what the aims of the organisation is, of what the team is, of what the working relationship between two or more people is, you know, what can help to create and sustain that possibility.
And it's important to do that at every level of the organization, really, and we'll be looking at that in future webinars. Even within the same organization, two teams might have a different perspective when folks talk across each other. For example, in one team that might be considered spirited and dynamic debate, and in another team in the same organization that might be considered extremely disrespectful. So it's important to have that conversation at every level of the organization. And then looking at the role of bystanders, they're both impacted by and they have a huge impact on the organizational culture. And if you're able to get to a place with where anybody in the organization is able to go up to anybody else and say, I just observed this interaction and let me check it out with you. It seems that this is different from the norm or the agreement that our team had. That sounds very different from somebody taking it upon themselves to kind of be the respect police. Although we want folks looking out for each other, even in the absence of group alignment, but how much stronger, how much more conducive to an organizational culture of respect would it be when everybody shares that mutual responsibility?
So what we're, in a sense, as a summary of what we're wanting to say, we're wanting to say that allegations of bullying can be used as an opportunity for workplace transformation at personal, team, and organizational levels. And that's not necessarily a kind of, how can I put it, a kind of a common perspective. You know, quite often allegations of bullying means people are kind of having to run into the corner to make sure that, you know, everything's being done properly, no one's being kind of seen as aligned with the bully. You know, there are all sorts of excuse me, kind of separations and kind of moving into polarities that goes on. But what we're saying is that actually it can be an indication of something that can be an opportunity for change, that the individuals involved on a personal level can learn something about themselves and how they're interacting with each other, and how that contributes or detracts from the aim of the team. And the team can look at how the situation arose in the first place, or be aware of the fact that it's possible to improve such relationships, rather than always assume that everything was going to be kind of negative from that point onwards whenever such an allegation occurs. And obviously that then has an impact on the organizational level, because that team is operating more effectively. And, you know, rather than just simply see it in those kind of mechanical terms, they're operating in a way which is more kind of humane towards each other, and more supportive and more content, hopefully. So it can have an impact at all levels, but ultimately it's starting at the individual or personal level. So allegations of bullying can be used as an opportunity for workplace transformation at personal, team, and organizational levels. That's very much what we're saying in this webinar.
And I think, Alan, that we have our final poll, our final request for input,
yep,
available now, and we're asking you about your own transformation. What can you do differently following this webinar?
That's right. Let me just set that up again. My big challenge for the evening, doing the poll.
It is up.
Oh, it is up, is it? Good.
Yes.
Okay, good. So we'll give you a few seconds to consider that.
I'm going to intervene. My sense is that we're getting towards the end of our time, and I know coming up in a slide or two was if we'd had more time to have questions by way of the chat feature. My sense is we probably won't have an opportunity for that today. But I know Alan and Marlene are really eager to hear from everyone in terms of what you want to know more moving forward, and we also will be sharing a little bit in the last couple of slides about what the future holds. But I wonder whether we should maybe just proceed to that, and then maybe you can make a comment or two in a moment, Alan and Marlene. I wanted to take this opportunity of thanking you both for a truly wonderful presentation. I know I learned a lot, and others did too. The HR Mediation Academy will be putting on further educational webinars. Plan is to have something on the investigation, so we know when we can not investigate without getting into trouble with the compliance attorneys. And I'll be sharing more about that in upcoming weeks, so do look out for emails. The exciting piece, and this is maybe where Alan and Marlene, you can come in again and share a little bit more again around the questions and the answers we get. If Alan, if you can move to that final slide, is to let folk know about the outcome of us working together, is that we have formed what we refer to as Workplace Bullying Innovations, to be a force for wisdom and respect in how the challenge of bullying is addressed in the future. Alan and Marlene will be providing ongoing webinars, and we invite you to sign up for updates about upcoming events. I'm proud to support both Alan and Marlene and the work they're doing. I know it's making a positive difference in the world for all of us, and I know they're going to be leaving it more respectful. So thank you everyone for attending. Marlene and Alan, if you want to make some final comments about the results of that poll, if we end it, And then also, any thoughts you have about workplace bullying innovations as we let the good folk go, because we're almost at our time.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say the results were very much in favour of the first two options: shift my use of terms like bully and victim, promote early access to dealing with behaviour concerns, and worry less about proving the label of bully. So that's 47% and 40%. And the other two, I won't go into detail on these, the other two were 5 and 9%. But I'd just like to say a big thank you to you, John, for enabling us to kind of carry this webinar through and supporting us throughout that. You very much respect the amount of work you put in to help us and support us through doing this, and also to Marlene for working alongside me with it, and also to everybody who's turned up. We've been really grateful for the number of people who signed up for this, far in excess of what we were expecting, and we hope you found it interesting and useful.
Thank you all so very much. Thanks to participants, Alan and John, can't thank you possibly enough. Very excited about workplace bullying innovations, and we really want to be responsive to your needs, to the needs of folks who are listening today. So please send us your feedback.
Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate the attendance. And thanks again, Alan and Marlene. It was a real pleasure working together.
Likewise, John. Thank you.
The same.